in that sobering up process, as the Canadian ambassador in Santiago sent that cable, there were thousands of Chileans being illegally incarcerated in the infamous soccer stadium in Santiago, being raped, being tortured, and in many cases being killed because they supported the elected Allende government. And you have the Canadian ambassador making a comment like that. And Canada's role in destabilizing and overthrowing the Allende government goes back actually quite a few years. So in 1964, Eduardo Frei won presidential elections in Chile. Salvador Allende, who was an openly Marxist, socialist-oriented presidential candidate, the leader of the socialist-oriented movement in Chile, did quite well in those 1964 elections. That scared Washington, that scared Ottawa. Canada began its first ever aid program to a South American country, to Chile, provided $6.4 million in aid to the Eduardo Frei government. In 1970, when Salvador Allende won elections, immediately that aid program was cut off. Likewise, Export Development Canada cut off export credits to the elected Allende government. On October 2nd, 1973, within 3 weeks of the coup in Chile, Export Development Canada restarted export credits to the Pinochet dictatorship. Likewise, Canada supported cutting off International Monetary Fund credits to the elected Allende government immediately after the coup, supported the restarting of IMF credits to the Pinochet dictatorship. And within 5 years of the coup, Canadian economic interests, Canadian corporations, had more than $1 billion invested in Augusto Pinochet's brutal Chile. So we think of Canadian aid, again, as going to support development, poor people, the environment. In fact, it often goes to support particular Canadian economic interests. In the late 1980s, or throughout the 1980s, many African countries adopted IMF, International Monetary Fund-backed structural adjustment programs. A main thing that these structural adjustment programs did was open up countries, African countries, resource sectors to foreign penetration, to foreign mining companies. Canada has provided hundreds of millions, probably into the billions of dollars of Canadian aid has gone to supporting these IMF structural adjustment programs. And I'm just on a quick little aside. I did about half a dozen political science courses at Concordia University in Montreal that talked about the International Monetary Fund. And not once in any of these courses I took was Canada's role in the creation of the IMF and the World Bank ever mentioned, or Canada's role in supporting these structural adjustment programs ever mentioned in these 6 courses. All we talked about is the US role in that process. Anyway, so Canadian aid has gone to opening up indirectly via IMF structural adjustment programs, has gone to opening up African countries and other countries' mining sectors to foreign exploitation. But Canadian aid is and in the case of Africa, there's been a huge boom to Canadian mining companies. In 1989, less than $250 million of Canadian mining investment in Africa, and now it's reached almost $15 billion. So these Canadian companies have benefited greatly. We often talk about how China, the media often talks about how China is buying up Africa. Very rarely do we hear about how Canada, a much smaller country than China, has immense purchasing of African resources. But directly, Canadian aid has gone to supporting opening up countries' mining sectors to foreign exploitation, particularly Canadian mining companies. With 60% of the world's mining companies based in Canada, it's of course to Canadian Canadian capitalist interests to open up the world's mining sectors. But in the case of Colombia, CIDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, in 1997 began an $11 million program to open up Colombia's mining sector to foreign exploitation. It was headed by a research institute close to the mining companies in Calgary. They asked Canadian and American mining companies what they would like to see in a new Colombian mining code, and they got what they wanted in 2001. So royalty rates that corporations, foreign corporations, paid on exploiting minerals were reduced from 10% for exports above 3 million tons and 5% of exports less than 3 million tons. That was the previous royalty rate. That was all reduced down to 0.4%. So now foreign companies taking resources out of Colombia only have to pay 0.4% of a royalty rate, a tax to the government when removing those minerals. And according to the head of Colombia's mining sector union, quote, "The new code flexibilized environmental regulations, diminished labor guarantees for workers, and opened the property of Afro-Colombian and indigenous people to exploitation." So that's an example of what Canadian aid is doing around the world, not supporting development, but supporting particular Canadian economic interests. One of the major myths of Canada that supports this sort of broader myth, this idea that Canada is a force for good and sort of a benevolent peacekeeping country around the world, is that Canada is one country that's had the capacity to build nuclear weapons, but has chosen not to. There's more to the story. The CF-104 Starfighter, Canadian fighter jet based in Germany in the early 60s, had no gun. All it held was a thermonuclear weapon. So you actually had Canadian fighter jets based abroad that had nuclear weapons, nuclear-armed fighter jets. Since the early 50s, Canada has allowed the US to station nuclear-armed fighter jets here in Canada. By 2004, Canada was producing 30% of the world's uranium, the largest producer of uranium. And since the late 1940s, when there was a UN resolution to abolish nuclear weapons, Canada opposed that resolution in the late 1940s. And since that time, Canada has either opposed or abstained on all UN resolutions calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons. So one of the myths, or one of the supporting documents of the broader myth of Canada as a force for good, is that, well, every country in the hemisphere, with the exception of Mexico, severed relations with post-revolution Cuba. The only two countries that didn't sever relations with post-revolution Cuba were Mexico and Canada. And that's supposed to be an example of Canada standing up to the big bad bullying Americans. There's more to that story. The book 3 Nights in Havana explains, quote, "Recently declassified State Department documents have revealed that, far from encouraging Canada to support the embargo," that's the US embargo of Cuba, "the United States secretly urged Prime Minister Diefenbaker to maintain normal relations because it was thought that Canada would be well positioned to gather intelligence on the island." And that's precisely what Canada has done, primarily through the Communications Security Establishment, which is based in the Canadian Embassy in Havana and based in Canadian embassies all around the world. It's the arm of the Canadian government that spies on foreign governments and other countries. And through the Communications Security Establishment and other sources, Canada, according to a number of books on the intelligence world, on the spy world, provides, quote, "the best military intelligence to the Americans on the Cuban government."